European Communities Act 1972 repeal bill, second reading.
Mr. Douglas Carswell.
I beg to move that the bill be read a second time. Mr. Deputy Speaker, I bring forward a bill to repeal the European Communities Act. I do so not merely supported by many outside the House, I do so as explicitly directed by more than 5,000 readers of the Guido Fawkes blog site. This is, Mr. Deputy Speaker, the first ever crowd-sourced private members' bill. MPs are sometimes accused of not sharing the concerns of ordinary voters, of not sharing the priorities of those outside the Westminster village. This bill was voted on by those outside Westminster. Withdrawing from the European Union can no longer be dismissed as unthinkable. It's no longer a marginal view confined to mavericks. It is a legitimate point that is starting to go mainstream. It might have been many months since this House had a frank and open discussion about the merits of our EU membership, but that perhaps tells us more about the shortcomings of the Westminster system than it can inform us about the cost benefits of being part of the EU club. According to a recent poll by Survation, a majority of voters, more than at any time in the past 3 decades, now want Britain to leave the European Union. 51% of people are in favour of leaving the European Union. Only 34% want to remain in. This is the highest level of discontent for a generation. The idea that we should leave the European Union may find very few champions amongst the Sir Humphreys in King Charles Street, but that just tells us how out of touch the Whitehall establishment has become. And if we cannot get new people, perhaps, Mr. Deputy Speaker, we should try getting some new Sir Humphreys. It is not just the people who want out. It is, we hear, members of the Cabinet who have started to come around to the view that Britain may indeed be better off out. Britain joined the common market because, the people were told at the time, it was going to be good for our economy. What we lost in terms of political sovereignty would be compensated for by material gain. And looking back at the time, it's a view that I can understand. We joined at a time when Western Europe had been growing spectacularly. The common market that we joined in the early 70s could look back at 2.5 decades of the most spectacular growth. It seemed as if we were joining a prosperous trade bloc. In 1973, Western Europe accounted for 38% of total world output. But in 2010, that figure had shrunk to 24%. In 2020, it will be 15%.
I congratulate my honourable friend on once again making history in this House. Given what he's just said, may I ask how he would respond to the Financial Secretary, who I see from the order paper today, is inviting us to agree that tough decisions are being taken in countries across Europe to stimulate economic growth?
I thank my honourable friend for his intervention. I'd be more than a little bit sceptical of such claims. I mean, I'm no Keynesian, but the idea that somehow what's happening in Europe is producing prosperity and growth, and that the measures being taken across Europe, particularly in southern Europe, are producing prosperity seems absurd to me. Far from joining a growing and prosperous free trade area, it turns out that what we actually joined has been a very cramped and declining customs union. Far from joining a rising economic powerhouse, we've shackled ourselves to a corpse. Being part of the European Union hinders rather than helps us to prosper. The Common Agriculture Policy obliges us to subsidise our farmers, competitors in continental Europe, raising food prices and penalising the poor. The Common Fisheries Policy has caused an ecological catastrophe in the seas around us. The EU's social and employment rules have made us uncompetitive. EU directives have struck entire industries, art dealers, slaughtermen, cheesemakers, temping agencies, fund managers. On the EU's own statistics, the cost of regulation outweigh the benefits of being in the single market by a ratio of 5 to 1. According to the European Commission's own statistics, the cost of regulatory compliance amounts to 600 billion euros. The benefits of being in the single market are 120 billion euros. The common external tariff has forced us behind protectionist walls. Far from giving us free trade, these tariffs are between 5 and 9%, are higher now than they were a century ago. At a time when the non-Western world is enjoying an extraordinary boom, an extraordinary surge of prosperity and growth, we're forced to watch. Rather than join in, we're cut off by the EU's mercantilist mindset. We pay for the privilege, and this is the absurdity, we pay for the privilege of being members of this poverty-producing club. Britain has paid more into the EU budget than she has received back in every year bar one since we joined. We don't just pay, our membership fee for being part of this club has risen by 70% within the past 3 years. In 2009, our net contribution to the Brussels budget was £5.3 billion. In 2010, it rose to £9.2 billion, and our gross contribution is nearly £20 billion.
My honourable friend, give way.
With pleasure.
I'd like to congratulate my honourable friend on bringing forward this bill, which I wholeheartedly support. Is he as shocked as I am to discover that in the 5 years of the last government, our membership fee was some £19 billion, but in the 5 years of the present coalition government, that membership fee will be £41 billion. How many nurses, policemen, doctors, teachers would that pay for?
My right honourable friend is absolutely bang on the money. You would expect that this government would do something about it, but instead, we've heard many debates in this House about the need for austerity and cuts. Members on both sides of the House have expressed their concern about what reduced public spending might mean in their constituencies. Yet all the coalition's austerity savings taken together don't add up to anything like our annual EU membership fee. The 2010 increase in our net contribution is greater than the sum total of all the austerity savings made since the last general election. Exactly. We're having to justify austerity in our constituencies when we have an administration that is handing over ever larger sums of our money to remain part of this austerity club. And too many people in Whitehall, too many of the grand Sir Humphreys in Whitehall still think of the EU as though it's vital to our economic survival. But the fact is it's becoming less important almost by the hour. In the first 6 months of this year, our exports to the EU fell by 18%, while our exports to the rest of the world rose by 28%. On every measure, the EU now accounts for a minority of our trade. That's not to say, of course, that the single market is not important. It's very important. It remains a large market. But it's just one market alongside NAFTA, Mercosur, and all the rest. No one's suggesting that we have to give up our sovereignty. No one's suggesting we have to give up our sovereignty in order to sell to them. We joined the EEC, as it then was, because we wanted to be part of a growing trade bloc. In the event, the growth has taken place elsewhere. As David Cameron said in Birmingham, European Council meetings are dominated by discussions about propping up Greece. On the other side of the world, China is moving ahead so fast, it's creating a new economy the size of Greece's every 3 months. While the Eurozone stagnates, while it lurches from one round of bailout and borrow blunders, usually supported by our Treasury, to the next, the IMF expects the Commonwealth to grow by 7% every year for the next 5 years. This year, the Commonwealth's output, the Commonwealth's GDP, overtook that of the EU for the first time. In just 2 years, exports to Brazil have increased by 25%, to China by 40%, to Russia by 80%. It's not me saying that, it's David Cameron saying that. It's to this government's great credit that it recognises the need for us to realign ourselves economically. The government, I think, has been successful in trying to refocus our efforts on trading with the wider world, on opening us up to the wider world. But I would argue that being part of the European Union is holding us back. It's stopping us from opening up the trade arrangements that we desperately need to be part of that network of global prosperity. The Minister, I know, is an honourable man, a very clever and intelligent man, and in many ways a great man.
Feel free to intervene.
He can see beyond the Foreign Office brief on many things. He knows these arguments that I'm making. I hope that in his response he's going to share with the House his view on the extent to which we can realign ourselves economically if we remain part of the European Union. Can we? I don't believe we can. Could we have perhaps a Swiss-type relationship where we had access to Europe's markets, but we could at the same time negotiate entirely independent bilateral agreements with non-EU members on our own? Of course, the Whitehall elite, the Sir Humphreys and the Sir Jeremys, will say that we need to be part of the single market. But do we? Must we be part of the single market in order to trade with the EU? China seems to gain market access, and last time I checked, they're not part of the single market. Now, of course, a firm that seeks to trade with the EU, China, Japan, Australia, America, they have to conform to EU standards in order to sell their products there. But do they have to comply 100% with all EU regulations under the auspices of the single market? No, and their economies are in much better shape because of it. Of all the economic activity that takes place in this country this year, about 80% will entirely revolve around internal trade. About 20% will be dependent upon external trade. Of that 20% that is external, less than half, in other words, between 8 and 9% of total output is going to be dependent upon trade with the EU. How can it possibly be right that all economic activity that takes place in this country has to be 100% compliant with single market rules, when only 8 or 9% of economic activity is geared towards trade with the EU?
I'm not referring give way. Most grateful for giving way, and I'm enjoying his very impressive speech enormously. Isn't our trade relationship with the EU even more absurd in that on a regular basis and on a worsening basis, we actually have a trade deficit with the European Union? In other words, the EU is doing better out of our EU membership than we are.
My honourable friend is absolutely right. We have a massive trade deficit with Euroland, and to partly compensate for that, we have to run a trade surplus with the rest of the world. But interestingly, when we first joined the Europe Club, we had a much more balanced trade with Europe. I think that if we were to withdraw from the European Union, I can't see that Siemens or some of the great wealth creators in continental Europe will be any less likely to want to trade with us. So, why should a business that's producing goods and services to sell outside the EU, to say India or America, why should they be subject to red tape brought about under the auspices of the EU single market? I'll leave you with this thought. Switzerland is outside the European Union, and yet they manage to do 4.5 times more trade per head with the EU from outside than we do from within. My question to the Minister is, if Switzerland, with a population of 7 or 8 million, can obtain more favourable terms with the EU than we have, could we not, with a population of in excess of 60 million, obtain even better terms than Switzerland has? Being in the European Union has done dreadful harm to our economy. It has put us in the global slow lane, but it's hampered our democracy too. Public policy decisions are no longer made by those of us vulnerable to the wishes of the electorate, no longer by those who have to stand in marginal seats with the risk of being thrown out of office, but by remote, unaccountable officials in Whitehall. Of course, the Oxbridge-educated Sir Humphreys in Whitehall like being part of the EU. It allows the Oxbridge-educated Sir Humphreys to carry on making public policy. They don't have to answer to the hoi polloi outside. But it's corroded our democracy. From agricultural policy to banking policy, from environmental rules to rules on bin collection. Decisions that ought to be made by those vulnerable to the democratic process are made by technocrats. And technocracy is no more effective, in fact it's a good deal less effective at making good public policy than democracy. What is the point of voting if those you elect have no power? I can't help but noticing that voter turnout has fallen every decade that we've been a member of the Euro Club. I will wind up my comments, Mr. Deputy Speaker, by saying that I brought forward this bill not in the expectation that it will become law. Yet. Instead, my aim is that we begin to give serious thought to the mechanics of withdrawal. Leaving the European Union, Mr. Deputy Speaker, is going to be simple, but it will not be easy. It will be simple because a simple act of this Parliament can get us out. But what then? What about all the acres of public policy that have been created under the auspices of the European Communities Act? How might we retain perfectly sensible, for example, environmental protection rules, yet change some of the secondary laws that need repealing? What process are we going to engage with and use to sort out the difference between public policy that we wish to retain and that we need to get rid of? Do we need a different mechanism to deal with directives versus mechanisms to repeal, for example, regulation? How do we, and I say this as a staunch parliamentarian who's suspicious of all who sit on every front bench, how do we balance the needs of the legislature oversee this process against the need of an executive to then take action? My proposal in this bill is just one model. I propose that all secondary measures and laws would remain in place, but ministers would then, subject to the approval of this House, have the power to repeal or amend. But is this idea of statutory instruments and ministerial fiats enough? Might it not be an idea also to give select committees specific powers to try to overturn regulations introduced under the auspices of the 1972 Act? I hope that by putting this bill before the House, I initiate some serious thought about the mechanics of withdrawal. It can be done, but those of us who want out need to give it some serious thought. The question of Britain's EU membership is no longer settled. It is now an open question. Many of us in this House and indeed in the country now openly question our EU membership. A referendum is coming. It will boil down to in or out. The case for out gets stronger. But we need to give people a sense of what self-government is going to look like, what it's going to feel like. I hope this bill helps us to begin to think very carefully about what being a self-governing democracy once again would mean. The whips may seek to talk this bill out. These questions will not go away. Thank you.
The question is that the bill be read a second time.